The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
It's being recorded? Yeah.
Right, so you can go full screen and
Good morning, guys. We'll be getting started here just in a minute. You good? Yeah. All right.
oh no, there's 10.
There's 36 now. You ready?
Go for it.
How many people do we have?
All right, now there's 36.
But you have 62 sign up.
Do you want to wait a bit longer, or you want to start?
No, just wait a few minutes, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you can just tell them we're waiting for people. Okay.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Kara, and I will be going over some logistics with you before we get started. Welcome to the third webinar on the 5-year plan for air and deposition monitoring in Alberta, being facilitated by AEP's Environmental Monitoring and Science Division. We are delighted that you could join us today. Before I hand you over to your presenter for the session, please note the following instructions. You are currently in listening mode. You will be able to hear the presenters but not speak unless unmuted. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the presentation. However, if you have a question during the presentation, you can either click the raise your hand icon and we will unmute you when we are ready to take your question, or type your question in the chat box. Please note that you must enter the audio PIN that was provided to you to enable us to unmute you. If you have any issues with joining the webinar, email info@awc-casa.ca and someone will get back to you. Please note that this session is being recorded. If you have any concerns with this, please let us know. We hope that you enjoyed today's session. With that, I will now turn you over to your presenter.
Thank you very much, Kara. This is Bob Myrick here with the Director of Airshed Sciences with Environmental Monitoring and Science Division of Alberta Environment and Parks. And we're here today to present our third webinar on the 5-year air quality and deposition monitoring plan, as indicated on the first slide. I just wanted to stop for a second, and I'm not sure if people can type in if they could hear me okay. If you can hear me okay, just let me know. Yeah, if you can't hear me, maybe let me know. Although maybe nobody can hear me. Okay, loud and clear. Thanks very much. Okay, that's good. Okay, so we will get started. So as I mentioned, this is our third webinar. I wanted to give credit to the people behind the scenes, or maybe sometimes in front of the scenes, who have been really doing the work on the plan. We have Yeni Aklilu in the room here right now. We can ask her the tough questions. And we also have Kristen Adams. We can ask her the easier questions. she's nodding her head, yes. We also have Greg Wentworth, who's done a lot of work on the plan. He's currently on parental leave, so obviously could not make this webinar. And Naomi Tam and Cassandra Brown have put a lot of work towards this plan as well. So it really has been a joint effort. I need to know how to get to the next slide.
Just hit the arrow key.
Okay, sounds good. So the format of our presentation is indicated on the slide here. We're going to give a bit of an overview and then talk about the plan content. It's a fairly long presentation, so hopefully you will stay engaged during the whole presentation. So under the plan content, we're going to talk about the scope of the plan and the monitoring questions. The major part of the presentation is the core long-term monitoring network, which includes the air monitoring network and also a deposition monitoring network. We also are going to talk about a process for initiating and preparing for focused air monitoring and deposition monitoring studies, complementary air monitoring technologies and methods, emerging issues that we will be addressing in the plan, and also data evaluation and reporting, which is often forgotten about, but that's a very important aspect. And then our next steps, because it's never over. So this is the third in 3 planned webinars. The first webinar was November 27th. The second one was in March. And then today's our third one, and where we're presenting our draft results and then asking for feedback from stakeholders. And we can get feedback either during this webinar or after this webinar. Feel free to send emails to myself. I believe I have my email address at the end of the presentation. And as Kara mentioned, this is all being recorded. So you'll have my contact information there as well. We plan to have our draft 5-year plan ready for your review by the end of the summer. So we're going to go through right now areas where we're looking for stakeholder feedback that are part of the plan, and so I'll just go through these. So the first one is regarding station classification. At the second webinar, we talked about our process for classifying air monitoring stations, existing air monitoring stations in the province, and this is just the permanent continuous monitoring stations. We've completed that classification process, and we sent out an Excel file to a large mailing list. Hopefully everyone has received it. And what we're doing is we're asking primarily Airsheds who operate some of the monitoring stations to look at the classifications and see if they make sense from your perspective. So as an example, there may be a monitoring station that we've classified as a fence line station because it met our criteria for a fence line station, but you say, no, this is not a fence line station, this is an impacted community station or something like that. So we're looking for that kind of input. We also sent out an Excel file for our gap analysis, and this is for our communities with gaps. So this is an Excel spreadsheet showing the ranking of the communities that we, based on our analysis, were highest priority to implement monitoring based on having a gap. So we are also asking for your input on that particular file, and if there are any other local monitoring needs that have not been captured. For the complementary air monitoring section, we know that many airsheds are working on what we call complementary air monitoring technologies, such as use of the air pointer, experimentation with compact air sensors, and other technologies that are, I would suggest, as non-traditional. And if you have any I guess, input from that perspective, where we want to hear about that, and also we want to work with Airsheds and other groups on developing and testing of new non-traditional complementary monitoring technologies. On emerging issues, we do identify 5 major emerging issues based on our work and our analysis, but I'm sure we haven't captured all of the emerging issues in the province. So we're very, very interested in hearing from you on what we've missed, or even your comments on the issues that we've identified. And we'll be going over these at the end of the presentation. And implementation items, we have throughout this particular presentation close to 50 implementation items that EMSD is going to be leading over the next 5 years. So that's a lot of implementation items, and I think that list likely will grow by a few before we're done this particular report. So we're going to go through all of those during this presentation after each section, and where we would like, and I think as part of our ongoing review process, we need to provide updates to stakeholders on our status of implementation. So we're asking how you would like to be informed, what's the best mechanism. So this next slide here basically shows our monitoring areas of focus with a triangle, with the bottom of the triangle being wider, which indicates that's where we spent most of our time right now, is looking at the core long-term monitoring network. And that's a core air and core deposition long-term monitoring network. So that's the routine monitoring that's necessary to look at indicators for current state and trends reporting. And then if you move up on the triangle, where we spent time, but not maybe quite as much, is looking at complementary monitoring technologies and focus studies. And this is supportive monitoring, so this supports the long-term monitoring network, and also we're looking at non-traditional technologies that can be used to conduct focused monitoring studies as well. And then at the top of the triangle here, we see something called emerging issues. So these are the emerging issues that appear that they will become more important over the next 5 years, and issues that we need to address. So we do discuss this in the report. However, we haven't necessarily developed a plan to address each specific emerging issue at the present time. The next slide here shows that air monitoring and deposition monitoring in our province is conducted through a distributed model. In many jurisdictions, air monitoring is done either by the government or by a government agency. However, Alberta is fairly different than other organizations, where we have a distributed model, where we have airshed organizations, and we have 10 airshed organizations that deliver most of the monitoring for our province, approximately 70 to 75 permanent continuous monitoring stations. Alberta Environment and Parks only operates about 10% of the monitoring stations in the province. And then there's additional monitoring also by Environment and Climate Change Canada, primarily focused in the oil sands region, and also as part of the National Air Pollution Surveillance Program. And of course, the compliance-based fence line monitoring, which I see as becoming more important as being included as part of our evaluations as the data becomes more available, hopefully when the AMD is in effect in January of 2019. So really the point of the plan here is monitoring is conducted through a distributed model, and changes to the system need to be enacted through this distributed process as well. Government can't just come in and do whatever we want. We want to work with stakeholders. So now we'll get into more of the meat of the presentation.
This question, do you want to address it? Sure.
Sorry, we just saw a question come up, and the answer is yes, we'll send the documents. So the contents of the plan are what we'll talk about. So under this first out, we'll talk about the long, let's see what we'll talk about. I'll just go to the next slide. Okay. First, the scope of the plan. So the plan does have monitoring questions, which I'll go over, and I've gone over these at the last couple of presentations. The text has changed a little bit, but the monitoring questions really will form the foundation of the monitoring plan. We also have evaluated the core long-term air and deposition monitoring network. We've identified the core long-term monitoring objectives and also the minimum air quality parameters that should be monitored at the long-term monitoring stations. We also have outlined a process to consistently initiate and conduct focused air monitoring studies, trying to get away from more, what I would suggest in some cases, maybe more in Alberta environments per case, where we've implemented more of an ad hoc process for addressing focused monitoring studies. We want to formalize that and make it more transparent. We also describe complementary monitoring, which can support long-term monitoring and also be used for focused monitoring studies. We've identified relevant air and deposition emerging issues, and also a list of the major air and deposition monitoring, evaluation, and reporting activities that will be conducted by EMSD over the next 5 years.
There's another question. Do you want to answer it or wait?
I think we're going to wait to address the questions till the end, because that might be better to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of the monitoring questions, I'll go over these fairly quickly, because we've done this in the past at previous seminars. The first question is, how does ambient air quality and atmospheric deposition in Alberta compare to regional, provincial, and national triggers, limits, and standards indicated in management frameworks? So basically, this is the core monitoring network that needs to be in place to report against CAKES, to report against the triggers and limits in the regional plans, and to report against any other provincial standards or frameworks that may be in place. So it's the long-term air and deposition monitoring network, what monitoring needs to be in place. The next question is, what are the relevant sources, concentrations, and or deposition of atmospheric pollutants that may impact human health, odor, or ecosystem function? So this question was really intended to capture additional questions that may be spawned as a result of the long-term monitoring network, where there could be issues that need to be addressed by focused monitoring. So if there's odor issues that have been that are indicated by the public, or if there are elevated, or if there are levels of air pollution that exceed triggers or limits, additional monitoring may need to be done in that regard. So that's really what question number 2 is intended to address. Question number 3 is, have the spatial distribution, concentrations, and or deposition of air pollutants changed over time? And how do these relate to factors such as changes in emissions and climate change? So this is looking at long-term trends in air quality and deposition, but it's also looking at long-term trends over time. And as we go on in the presentation, most of the monitoring we do right now is in the large cities and also close to industries. So we do have those areas covered pretty well. But looking at trends over the entire province of Alberta, we need to address some gaps so that we can address this particular question. And question number 4 is, how will air quality and its effects on human health and ecosystem function change in the future under various emission scenarios? So looking forward and looking at changes in emissions scenarios that we see, and also looking at climate change. How do we see air quality being impacted? And really, this is something we have not addressed very much right now in our 5-year plan. It is a question that we need to address, we recognize, but it is a very challenging question. So now we'll start by talking about the long-term air monitoring network, and then we'll follow that by talking about the long-term acid deposition monitoring network. So what we did, and we went through this at our previous webinars, we went through a station classification process, and currently we don't have a station classification process for the province. So actually, maybe we do now over the last few months because we've developed one. And what the station classification process or classifications allow us to do is determine what parameters should be monitored at the stations, and actually I should say what the objectives of the monitoring stations are, and then based on the objectives, what parameters should be monitored at those stations. So as an example, if the station is classified as a large urban center monitoring station, one of the objectives would be to report against the Air Quality Health Index or report against the Canadian Ambient Air Quality Standards. So we definitely need to report the pollutant. We need to monitor the pollutants at the right frequency to be able to report against those particular standards. And also, we've developed quite a objective process that could actually be reran by somebody else, because it's based on data from the NPRI, and it's also based on modeled information. So if someone else wanted to use the same process and the same criteria that we've used, they should be able to demonstrate the same results. So there's actually a total of 7 station classifications. The first 4 are indicated on this slide with the primary objectives. So the first station classification is large urban centers, and these are centers which have a population greater than 50,000 people. Primary objective is to focus on human health. Impacted communities, and these are communities that are less than 50,000 people and are located near an industrial operation based on the National Pollutant Release Inventory. And the purpose of these stations is primarily to look at human health as well. So this could be a smaller community with industrial activity nearby. And again, this is for classifying existing monitoring stations. The next classification is for smaller communities, and these are smaller communities, smaller than 50,000 people, but don't necessarily have any industrial activity based on the National Pollutant Release Inventory. And then there's the near fence line monitoring stations. These are stations located within 5 kilometers, I believe, of industrial source based on the National Pollutant Release Inventory. The next 3 classifications, these are what we call regional monitoring stations. So if the 75 or so monitoring stations that currently exist, the permanent continuous monitoring stations that currently exist, do not fall into the previous 5 categories, then we used air modeling results for sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide to break up the province into background, hotspot, and intermediate levels based on predicted concentrations. So background, basically, as it says here, is to report indicators and trends in air quality at locations that are not influenced by local anthropogenic emission sources. And hotspot stations are stations that are in areas with higher predicted concentrations of SO2 and NO2, and basically are looking at cumulative impact of multiple sources. And then intermediate classification is basically all the areas in between hotspots and background stations. The next table here shows the 7 classifications again, and it shows some of the possible routine reporting products that we currently produce, such as Air Quality Health Index, Real-Time Air Quality Health Index, State of the Environment Reporting, which is trends, status and trends of air quality, Canadian Ambient Air Quality Standards, and Land Use Framework Reporting. And some of the minimum parameters that should be monitored at these stations are indicated in the rightmost column, and we are interested in your input on this. I wasn't going to go through this in a lot of detail at this time. I think you can probably take a look at this. So this is the process we use to classify the existing monitoring stations. We basically used all the stations that are reporting to Alberta Air Data Warehouse at the present time. Again, about 75 stations, continuous permanent monitoring stations. The classification is based on the population, census population data, the location and magnitude of nearby industries based on the National Pollutant Release Inventory, GEM-MAC, which is the Environment and Climate Change Canada model results of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide concentrations. And I think we also used some additional modeling information when we did our gap analysis.
Ammonia from salvage.
That's right, yeah. So classifications we're currently working with Airshed to adjust our classifications based on your local knowledge, what makes sense. And one thing I forgot to mention at the beginning of the presentation is whenever you see the blue text in the presentation, it means that we really want to get some input from Airsheds and stakeholders on this particular issues. So this blue text here says an Excel spreadsheet with the GIS classification results has been provided in a previous email, and we're asking Airsheds to check and see if this makes sense from your perspective and provide us any adjustments that that we should make. And we've already talked to a couple of Airsheds on this. This next slide shows the results of the classifications that we've done. As I mentioned, there's about 75 stations. About 20 of them are in large urban centers, which are greater than 50,000 people. And then another 20 that are near fence line. And once we actually get the industrial data reported through regulatory process, that number will go up by quite a bit. So what's indicated here on the rightmost part of the slide is the regional monitoring stations, the background, hotspot, and intermediate stations. You can see we don't have as many as background and intermediate monitoring stations, and I think those are some of the areas where we see significant gaps, and also in the smaller communities as well. So that shows the results of our analysis, and we did send you an Excel file with the list of the stations which are indicated on this slide. So that previous few slides was on the station classification of the existing monitoring stations. So what we did is we used a similar process to try to determine where the community gaps are in the province of Alberta. Gaps can be addressed by implementing a traditional monitoring station, or they can be addressed by using a complementary monitoring technique, which is like an air pointer system or some other monitoring system that we're looking at. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a traditional monitoring system, or also it could be addressed by a focused monitoring study or shorter term monitoring project. So the gap analysis was performed for communities and regional stations. And as I mentioned, it used the same process as the station classification, which used population, distance to the nearest station, industrial emissions, and modeled satellite ambient concentrations. This is the result of the gap analysis that has been conducted. So the results indicate that every population center with a population greater than 50,000 people does have a monitoring station currently in a province, so we don't have any gaps from that perspective. But one thing I did want to note is that if you do look at larger cities such as Edmonton and Calgary, which are much greater than 50,000 people, we didn't go and to the individual cities and say that this city must have 5 monitoring stations or 10 monitoring stations. We just said that monitoring must be done. So there was no gaps based on the criteria we used for the large urban centers. We did provide a ranked list of gaps on the right-hand side of the slide here, and it's primarily the medium-sized communities that are located relatively close to industries, and this is kind of the top 10 with a number of them tied at number 9. So you can go through this list, and the way we're going to use this list is to try to determine and prioritize how we and some of the airsheds, hopefully in the future, working with the airsheds, are going to address some of these gaps. And I know some of these gaps the airsheds are already looking at addressing these gaps. So moving on the gap analysis, this is more the regional gap analysis. So if you look on the map on the right, it shows all of the monitoring stations that were classified as regional monitoring stations. So in the red shaded areas of the province, primarily near Edmonton, the Edmonton-Calgary corridor, and up in the Fort McMurray area, those are what were considered the hotspot monitoring stations based on the modeling and satellite information. In the shading from kind of the yellow, green, and blue is the intermediate stations, and the area of the province that was considered intermediate class, with the blue squares as the monitoring stations that currently exist in those areas. And then the background areas along the Rocky Mountains and the foothills, and then up in northwest Alberta. So based on this, we only have one background station in the province, and that's located at Steeper. So I see that as a significant gap. We do have the hotspots covered fairly well, and maybe there are some gaps in there. And then we also have gaps in the intermediate monitoring as well. So we do see that there are gaps, but as I indicated at the bottom of the slide here, the challenge we have is to determine the optimal number of stations and the type of monitoring that we should be doing to address these gaps, and that's kind of our path forward. So what I'm going to start talking about here now are the implementation items or implementation tasks that we plan to do over the next 5 years. So these implementation items are based on the long-term air monitoring network, and we're going to do the same for all of the sections of the plan, and these are contained within the report that we're producing as well. So I was going to go through some of these, or go through all of these. There's quite a few of them. So I can't quite read the entire slide. But the first one is examine parameters monitored at current long-term monitoring sites and identify stations that do not meet minimum criteria for the identified class.
I can make it any smaller.
There we go. Or hide it for now anyway. The second item we have here is identify the redundancies and extraneous monitoring within the existing air quality monitoring network. We haven't quite figured out how we're going to do that yet, but that's a task that we need to look into. Third task, we have identify optimal locations or parameters to be monitored and appropriate technical specifications for one or more provincial air monitoring super sites. So what we've kind of floated the concept of developing super sites, primarily in some of the hotspot areas of the province, to look at cumulative impacts from urban sources and also from industrial sources. So we're floating out that idea, and these would be sites that would contain a lot of different types of monitoring technologies, including the complementary technologies that we're going to be going through later on. So we may have 1, 2, or 3 of those in a province. That's kind of what our thoughts are. Number 4 is for the top 5 gaps in the community monitoring, examine if there are planned complementary monitoring that meets community monitoring objectives. So as an example, for Lloydminster, it was indicated as the top, based on our ranking, as the top gap. But from what I understand, in Saskatchewan, Lloydminster is on the border between Alberta and Saskatchewan. In Saskatchewan, they have 2 air pointer systems located in the eastern part of Lloydminster. And if we were able to get the data from those particular air pointers and use it to use it for the air quality health index, that may address that particular gap. And that's just one example that I'm giving. Number 5 here is evaluate the need possible monitoring sites and data requirements for additional background monitoring in northwestern Alberta. So that's we've identified northwestern Alberta as a large gap, large spatial gap in monitoring, and likely will be one of our higher priorities to implement monitoring in the future. Number 6 is evaluate the need possible monitoring sites and data requirements for additional intermediate and hotspot regional monitoring in southern and central Alberta. So again, similar to number 5, but for intermediate and hotspot regions of the province. Number 7, work within the distributed air monitoring network to reduce redundancies and move resources to fill gaps and implement super sites where possible. So if we do identify redundancies or gaps and suggest that some stations or some resources should be moved or relocated, we would definitely want to work with Airsheds to do that. And number 8 is review the results from emerging technology evaluations and determine whether they can be used to address gaps in the core long-term air monitoring and deposition networks. So as I'll discuss later, we're working on evaluating the air pointer system as an example and seeing if it can be used as a long-term monitoring station, and if that's the case, how would it be calibrated? Because without getting into the details, there are challenges with calibrating a system like that. And then there are also other compact sensor systems that may also meet the needs to address gaps in the core long-term monitoring network. So enough about the long-term air monitoring network. Let's move on to the long-term deposition monitoring network. So the long-term deposition monitoring network, we did an evaluation of the existing network. We examined nearby land use, regional emissions, and Alberta natural regions, which there are 6 of. There are 6 in the province, to actually classify monitoring sites and identify gaps. So we used we did something called a suitability analysis based on criteria, which we'll show on subsequent slides. So this next slide shows the 9 wet deposition monitoring stations throughout the province that are operated by Alberta Environment and Parks. We do recognize that there are additional monitoring stations. I think there's 2 operated by WBIA and also by the West Central Airshed Society. Or maybe not by the West Central Airshed Society, but they're located within the West Central Airshed Zone. So what this shows here is the classification of those particular sites based on the National Atmospheric Deposition Program, which is a North American deposition monitoring program. Shows that we do actually have 3 monitoring stations located in urban areas, and which maybe don't meet the intent of our monitoring objective. And we also have 2 natural regions where we don't have monitoring, which is the grassland and the other one, which I can't.
Foothill.
Yeah, that's right, grassland and foothills. There we go. So some of the criteria that we used for the suitability analysis are indicated on this particular slide. So we used receptor sensitivity, and what we used here is critical load as the criteria. So areas that had a low critical load, or they didn't have the capacity to buffer acidifying substances, were considered high suitability for a monitoring station. Areas of high deposition for sulfur and nitrogen were considered high suitability. And also we wanted to have some road access to these monitoring stations without having to fly into all the monitoring stations. However, we didn't want to have roads with a busy highway right next to the monitoring station. So there's some criteria in that regard. Also, proximity to emission sources. We didn't necessarily want to have these particular monitoring sites right next to a large industrial source. So they're more located in the regional areas from our previous slides. So in the hotspot areas or intermediate areas from our previous slides. And also there is a soil monitoring network in the program. We use that as a criteria to try to be close to the soil monitoring sites as possible. So the results of the suitability analysis is indicated on this slide. The areas of red in north central and northeast Alberta are the areas that are most suitable for deposition, acidifying deposition monitoring based on the results of our analysis. And as you can see, we actually don't have a lot of monitoring within that area right now. Environment Canada is putting in a Catmon site at Peerless Lake, right? Oh, sorry, Jussard. Sorry, I got my places mixed up. It's at Jussard, which is just to the west of the red area for suitability analysis. So a couple of things is that we need to have more monitoring within the red area, but we also want to have monitoring in all the ecoregions within the province. And also indicated on this map are areas which we consider low suitability. So these are the large urban centers and also right on the industrial sites. So we want to be distanced from the large urban centers and the industrial sites. So I'll move on to the next slide. So on this slide, on the right-hand side, it does show the I think 6 ecoregions in the province of Alberta. So we do want to make sure we're representing all those ecoregions. Currently, we don't have any monitoring within the grasslands ecoregion, which is the southeast part of the province. We did have a station near Suffield at one time, but is no longer there. So we may want to reestablish that. And we don't have any monitoring in the foothills ecoregion, which is interesting as well. So it shows another area where there's a gap. And the table on the left does show that we do have deposition hotspots in most of these particular ecoregions. Obviously, more in the boreal ecoregion than some of the others, but it's a huge ecoregion as well. And maybe less so up in the Canadian Shield ecoregion. Okay, so based on the acid deposition suitability analysis, we have the following implementation items that we're planning to work on over the next number of years. We plan to relocate monitoring sites out of the urban areas, out of Edmonton, Calgary, and Fort McMurray. We plan to deploy precipitation depth monitoring equipment at all precipitation chemistry sites. Currently, we don't have those samplers at all the sites. You do need precipitation depth to calculate deposition. What we have been using is we've been using the volume of the collectors, which is not an accurate way of calculating your precipitation depth. We want to add, that's correct. We also want to add dry deposition monitoring, add at least 2 deposition monitoring sites, and this is monitors that we'd use to infer dry deposition. And as probably most people know on the phone, in Alberta, approximately half of the deposition we get, depending on where you are in the province, comes through dry processes such as absorption of gases or particulate matter, and the other half is through wet deposition processes. So by just measuring wet deposition, we're missing half of the deposition. We want to implement SOPs across all precipitation chemistry monitoring sites and make sure that they are followed, and we've already started to do that to try to improve the quality of the data. And of course, conduct site visits and complete site information forms for all the sites, and I think we've started that as well. More items here are ensure timely QA/QC of laboratory analysis from samples collected at precipitation chemistry sites, and we do have a process in place to do that within EMSD. Ensure the timely population of precipitation chemistry data and metadata into the database, and we do have that in place at the present time. Using historical data and collected at precipitation chemistry monitoring sites, evaluate and report on possible long-term trends. And we are collecting a lot of good data. However, we have not effectively reported out this particular data, something we want to start doing in the next couple of years as part of our state of the environment and environmental condition reporting. We are also looking at this is getting a little bit into the details, but we're looking at specific samplers for as a precipitation gauge, and the NOAA4 is the one that we're looking at here. So we're assessing the quality and also the collection efficiency gauge, the NCON precipitation collector. And these are collectors and gauges that are considered equivalents for the national atmospheric deposition program. So this is that's the end of the long-term air monitoring discussion, and also the long-term acid deposition monitoring discussion. So that's the bottom part of the pyramid, the triangle that I showed earlier in the presentation. Now we're moving up that triangle. So for focus studies, just go through the bullets on the slide here. Focus studies are really shorter term studies, and they're based on a specific science question or a specific question that we want to answer. So for a focus study, we need to clearly identify what the question is, and we need to put in place the monitoring that will address that question, and then we need to provide a report or some kind of evaluation of whether the monitoring in place did address that question or did not address that question, and then end the study. And a lot of cases, some of these focus studies go on forever because we didn't think it through and we didn't put the right monitoring in place, or they simply didn't address the question. So that's something we want to try to improve on in the future. So obviously these can inform air quality and deposition management actions and guide the improvement of long-term monitoring activities. So focused monitoring studies are initiated as a result of several different things. There could be routine data analysis that's collected through our long-term monitoring networks that bring up questions, and one example is the exceedance of the SO2 trigger in the Fort McMurray area, which leads to further investigation, which could be through monitoring or for further evaluation of information. It could be through public concerns, and again, up in the Fort McMurray area, we have a lot of public concerns regarding odor, where focus studies have been initiated. So those are just a couple of examples of focus studies, but there are many other examples throughout the province. And the way we get within EMSD, the way we get our information on how how to initiate our focus studies is we get it through our contacts within our operations branch. So our operations division. Our operations division has representatives on all of the airsheds, and if you are on an airshed, it's important that these focus monitoring studies be brought up to the people on the Alberta Environment representative on your airshed, so that we can bring it up to the provincial monitoring process if you want us to do some focus monitoring to address that particular issue. Okay, so I think that's all I wanted to say about this slide. So what we have done, or what we are doing, is we've identified, this is our implementation item for focus studies, identified, designed, and performed focus studies using a process described in this plan. And we do have a form that basically identifies the monitoring question and then the process to address that monitoring question, which is contained as part of the plan. So we'll talk briefly now about complementary air monitoring methods and technologies as well. So complementary monitoring refers to monitoring platforms that provide information on air quality and deposition that complements long-term air or deposition monitoring stations. And some examples that we are currently being used that we call complementary monitoring, and others may call it part of the core long-term monitoring network, but in our definition we call it complementary monitoring, is the passive sampling that is deployed by many of the airsheds throughout the province. Very important work. The integrated monitoring that's routinely done through the NAPS program. Regulatory monitoring, and also additional monitoring that's done in the oil sands region. Some of the work that we're actually doing right now to look at different complementary monitoring techniques is where, as I mentioned before, we're looking at the portable air monitoring platforms such as the air pointer system and a few other systems as well. We're looking at satellite remote sensing. Kristen Adams here has expertise in satellite remote sensing, and so I think this is an area where we have a lot of potential in the future to address gaps in the province. Utilizing citizen science, and we do have an implementation item on citizen science, but we haven't quite figured out how this is going to be done, and it doesn't necessarily have to be led by government. It could be led by airsheds or led by communities. And then another one is bulk deposition monitoring, and potentially using that to address some of the gaps in our acid deposition monitoring program. So looking more at portable air monitoring platforms, here we're looking at potentially using the air pointer system either in temporary applications or potentially permanent applications, which has some issues with calibrations, as a lot of the technical people on the phone will understand. But basically, these portable systems, you can put 3 or 4 continuous standard analyzers within these systems, and you can use it to calculate the air quality health index as an example. And they have been applied throughout the province, and they've been applied in Saskatchewan as well with some success. And I think it's important that if we do implement them more routinely in Alberta, that they follow a process for calibration that we all use, and that we really need to update the air monitoring directive as well to include protocols for operating these air pointer systems. Other systems that we're also looking at include ones that are pictured here. One is the Vaisala system. And I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, but it's capable of monitoring several different pollutants. The cost is much less than, say, the air pointer. And we want to look at the specifications and how well we can use this system potentially to complement our long-term monitoring program. Another system here is the Aeroqual system, similar to the Vaisala system. And then at a lower cost is the Purple Air monitoring system, which is a citizen science monitoring program. So this technology we see at the bottom left part of the slide is actually implemented I think it's a worldwide citizen science monitoring program. We have a few of these located in Edmonton now that we're testing and looking at how well they actually work to complement the monitoring program. And this is for the for particulate matter. So if you Google purple air, you will see a map showing the Purple Air Citizen Science Monitoring Program. So we're looking at a number of different technologies ranging in cost from, say, a few $100s to say $100,000, which is the air pointer system, and the Visala and Aeroqual systems are between $10,000 and $20,000. So there's differences in cost, and usually the more you pay, the better resolution you get in terms of detection limits and precision and accuracy. But do we need that level of precision and accuracy everywhere? And that's the question we need to ask. And also, do we have the money to implement traditional monitoring to address all these gaps? And I think we know the answer to that question. I think the answer is no. So also, I know Airsheds and other areas around the world are working on these types of monitories, testing them within their areas. I think it would be good to have a coordinated approach to test some of these sensors and then develop protocols for their use in Alberta. And I guess, as I said, these are being tested elsewhere in the world, and fairly comprehensive evaluations have been done. However, I don't know if comprehensive evaluations have been done in really cold weather climates. These seem to work fairly well down to temperatures of minus 10 degrees Celsius, but we get temperatures much colder than that for a large portion of the year. Satellite remote sensing is an area where I see a lot of potential in the future as well to address some of the gaps. There was recently the Tropomi satellite that was launched in October of 2017, and some of the parameters we can eventually get off of this satellite and other satellites include nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, ammonia, formaldehyde, and aerosols, and so on and so forth. The data sets are available to the public. However, they're not easy to work with at the present time. That's why we have experts like Kristen here to work on these data sets. We are looking at potentially using some of this data to look at trends in air quality and maybe even address some of the gaps in real time. But that is a challenge, I think, for the future. So implementation items related to complementary monitoring is we have, for the passive monitoring networks, we've been working with Airsheds to evaluate each of the networks to determine redundancies and gaps. We have worked with, starting from the south with Palliser Airshed, Calgary Airshed, Parkland Airshed, Ford Air Partnership, and now we're working with Leica and Wabia and Pramp, the oil sands airsheds, on evaluating their passive sampling networks. And every time we do this analysis, I think our evaluation process improves and gets more refined. So far, I think this evaluation process has been fairly successful, and we're continuing to use it. We're continuing to review literature for and assess data quality for air pointer and other commercially available portable air monitoring platforms, such as the Visala systems, Purple Air systems, Aeroqual systems, and those are ones we're looking at right now, including those equipped with compact sensors for potential use in long-term and focused monitoring in the future. We also have received some funding through an innovation fund within Alberta Environmental Parks to actually build our own portable air monitoring platform. So we put in a proposal and we received funding for this. So we're looking at utilizing some of the micro sensor technology that has been developed elsewhere and developing our own housing system to address some of those cold temperature issues. So we'll see how well this works. Number 23 here is evaluate and report on the usefulness of satellite data and assess spatial temporal variations of various pollutants through literature review and data analysis. So it's a lot of work that we're working on right now. Additional implementation items for complementary monitoring. Design and implement a pilot citizen science and or community-based air monitoring system to address an identified monitoring gap. So I think this is where it would make sense to partner with an airshed or a number of airsheds or any other groups to develop a citizen science monitoring program. Again, we haven't figured out exactly how we're going to do this, but I think if and when we do this, we want to use citizen science technologies that we have good confidence in, and we want to develop a monitoring program that's going to answer science questions that we have. We don't necessarily just want to implement citizen science for the sake of implementing citizen science. We want to have a focus objective of the program. And we want to review literature and take a closer look at the bulk precipitation samplers for potential use in our acid deposition monitoring network. So that's the complementary air monitoring section. So now we're moving on to emerging issues. So emerging issues is something we do touch on within our monitoring plan. We've identified 5 emerging issues right now, and I think there's more in the province that we haven't identified. And looking forward to your feedback on this. An emerging issue we have defined as monitoring questions that are not effectively addressed by current monitoring, evaluation, or reporting activities and are expected to significantly change over the next 10 years. So those basically is maybe causing worse air quality in the future. The emerging issue, or maybe better air quality too, that could be another emerging issue. So the emerging issues we have identified are based on our best knowledge, and again, we're looking for input from stakeholders and subject matter experts on other emerging issues that are relevant to Alberta. So we do have implementation items related to emerging issues, and we did go through this again at the previous webinar. So regarding wildfire smoke, as we indicated at our previous webinar, the frequency and number of wildfires are increasing in the province of Alberta and elsewhere throughout the world, which means that we're going to have more issues with wildfire smoke. So we're looking at evaluating the current network and suggesting improvements that we can systematically address, provide information on smoke from wildfires to the public. There's the new Canadian ambient air quality standards for nitrogen dioxide and sulfur dioxide. Based on initial evaluations using current data, it does look like we could exceed the orange levels or even the red levels in the future for nitrogen dioxide. And we need to be aware of this, and we need to make sure our network is adequate to monitor against the new Canadian ambient air quality standards. And then there's NO2 monitoring, and as mentioned at the previous webinar, there are interferences with our existing NO2 monitoring technology of a few percent up to over 100%. So basically, we may not be measuring true NO2 at all of the monitoring stations. And I know some of the airsheds are already working on looking at technologies to improve NO2 monitoring methods, such as I think Wood Buffalo and Fort Air Partnership are looking at this. We want to be aware of what's going on elsewhere in Canada and North America regarding true NO2 monitoring methods. I don't think we want to implement monitoring techniques that haven't been proven elsewhere in the world at the present time, or elsewhere in North America. Ammonia monitoring. Based on the NPRI, we have seen increases in emissions of ammonia in Alberta. It's one of the only pollutants where we do see increases over time. So we need to look at ammonia and perhaps develop a focus study to monitor in population centers and near sensitive ecosystems. The coal phase out. So there's a policy for phase out of coal-fired power plants by 2030. So what we want to do is we want to pay special attention, or perhaps do some additional monitoring at monitoring stations located that are most likely to be influenced by the changes in the coal phase out. So these are stations located closer to the power plants, and see if they're actually causing improvements in air quality, if the phase out is leading to improvements in air quality. Formaldehyde, and this is something that has come up as an emerging issue, as formaldehyde is a known carcinogen and emitted from natural gas processes, something that we need to be aware of and perhaps do some reviews and look at methods of understanding what formaldehyde levels are in Alberta. So those are just some of the, I guess there are 6 of those emerging issues, not 5 like I said earlier, that we've indicated in our report, but we're looking at your input regarding those emerging issues. So now data evaluation and reporting, we just have a couple of slides. I know it's a long presentation, but there's a lot of work that has been done. So regarding data evaluation and reporting, this is just a review of our current system. We do have the Air Quality Health Index is reported at many sites throughout the province. I think it's about 35 communities throughout the province. It's available in real time at www.airquality.alberta.ca and also through most Airshed websites, through Environment Canada's website, and also, well, I was going to say on the US EPA Air Now website, but I don't think they report to AQHI, they report to their Air Quality Index. But the data is also provided to the US EPA Air Now website. There's quality control data, which is provided through Alberta Air Data. And some of the airsheds also have the quality control data located on their website, especially with Buffalo Environmental Association. There is the prescriptive annual reports that we currently produce, which are the CAKES reports produced annually, and we're starting to catch up slowly but surely. And then the regional air quality framework reports, which are produced annually. And as the new regional air quality frameworks are developed for the North Saskatchewan region and Upper Athabasca region, there will be more of these reports that will have to be produced. We also do a number of technical reports and peer-reviewed publications. So that's now. So in the future, we are looking at a new central air database, and there has been funding allocated to develop a new central air database. The issue is timing. The requirement is for industry to report, industry and airsheds to report all of their data, including continuous and non-continuous data, to Alberta Environment and Parks by January of 2019. So that offers us a real big challenge in scrambling to develop a data system that will accept the data as required by the Air Monitoring Directive. So there is a process in place where there's dedicated effort being put to develop this new system. The data will be publicly accessible. There's provincial environmental condition reporting. When environmental monitoring, or I guess when EMIRA went back into Alberta Environment and Parks in 2016, there was legislation put in place that the chief scientist, which is Fred Rona, will develop a public reporting schedule and report environmental indicators on a routine basis. So we're currently in the process of developing a public reporting schedule for these indicators and developing these indicators. I understand that this will come out in the fall. That's the plan, and some of the first indicators that will likely come out are the air indicators, because we have a pretty good handle on what indicators should actually be reported. So that's something that we're working on. And other reporting, we have kind of stepped up our game, or are in the process of stepping up our game in terms of producing additional technical reports that are scientifically credible for a lot of the studies that we are working on. And because they need to be scientifically credible, part of the process is to go out for peer reviewed for a lot of the science reports that we're doing. So that takes an extra month, or at least a month or two, before they're actually released. So we do have a list. I think on my last list was we have 9 technical reports waiting to go through the process to be released. So once we get through this hump, we should start seeing these reports coming out more frequently from Environmental Monitoring and Science Division. And when I said 9 reports, that was just on the air side. I think we're nearing the end, and for the people who are able to stay on there. So we do have, we're not at the end yet. We do have some implementation items on data evaluation and reporting. So one is to continue, and this is for Environmental Monitoring and Science Division and Airsheds, continue to support and contribute to the development or replacement of the new air data warehouse, complete and release cakes and status of air quality reports for the land use frameworks on an annual basis. Condition of the environment reporting for air, finalize and implement a website for the oil sands region, which we're doing right now, and for the province, which hopefully we'll be doing before the end of the calendar year. And develop and implement an annual semi-automated process to screen long-term air monitoring data for data quality issues. So the data right now goes into the to Alberta Air Data Warehouse, not called the CASA Data Warehouse anymore. And it does go through an automated screening process prior to being loaded into the system. However, at times there are errors that are missed by the screening process. So what we're going to do with an EMSD is we're going to develop a next level of screening so that we catch problems that occur, so that they're not occurring for a long period, so we don't have to remove large blocks of data. And then the next one is develop and implement an annual assessment of station performance for long-term air monitoring sites. So this is something where we're talking about reporting on. It's almost maybe like a report card for air monitoring sites. How well are they performing? Based on uptime, based on based on audits, things like that. We haven't developed that report card yet, but that's something we're planning to do. Now, these are additional implementations items related to reviewing of the plan. So this is kind of more future-focused thinking. So number 37 here is engage with stakeholders and health ecosystem subject matter experts regarding the status of 5-year plan implementation annually. So on the previous slides, we've indicated, I think, 39 implementation tasks. So what we need to do is we need to evaluate these implementation tasks, the implementation status of these tasks, and then I think communicate these back to stakeholders. And the process for communicating these back to stakeholders we need to determine. And it could happen through CASA. I just threw that out there. So implementation items will be reviewed annually and assessed as complete, ongoing, not started, or no longer relevant. And this is very similar to the existing CASA process. New implementation items may also be added to the implementation table. So the monitoring plan we're doing right now is we'll have a report and we will distribute it to people, but it doesn't mean we're just going to stick it on a shelf somewhere. We're going to be using it and we're going to be implementing it, and it's likely going to be changed over time. And then the last item we have here is develop the next 5-year plan based on information gained. So that's something that likely would start in year 3 or 4. But we'll wait till that happens again. This has taken a lot of our time over the last few months. So next steps. So the draft document is in its final stages. We haven't prioritized the 39 implementation tasks yet, so we need to prioritize them and we need to schedule them. So it's almost like developing a Gantt chart for those implementation tasks. And when we're doing this, we have to make sure we have the appropriate resources to honor our commitment. We will provide the draft document to stakeholders for review, and also we'll be providing it for peer review as well. Additional stakeholder engagement may occur for meetings with specific stakeholder groups or subject matter organizations, and that will depend on the demand for additional stakeholder engagement. The plan will focus on guiding the work of EMSD over the next 5 years. So if you notice that the implementation items are primarily focused on what EMSD is going to be doing, with the items indicated in blue on where we also think we need help from Airsheds and other stakeholders. An implementation table will be included as part of the plan. And as indicated in the text at the bottom here, where appropriate, we are looking for opportunities for collaboration with regional airshed groups and organizations during implementation. So that being said, that's the end of the presentation. We'll now go look at our questions. And we'll remember Yanie's going to answer all the difficult questions. And Kristen, you got the easy ones.
Sounds good.
Questions on him?
Scroll up
Oh, goodness, go questions.
and you can read if you want to.
So we will start. We'll start with the first question, maybe at 9:45. Is that or?
Yeah.
No, that was Bill. He wants you to email the documents to him. So we can do
Okay.
that.
That's fine.
So yes, Bill, we will email you the documents. The next question is it says I'm from Harry. I'm filling in for Nadine. Has a date for feedback on the times already been provided? No, we haven't provided a date for feedback. We actually haven't. We haven't provided you with the report to look at. What we have done is we've shared kind of our work in progress over 3 seminars. So I'm hoping. I guess I'm open to feedback anytime. But what we're going to be doing is we're going to be providing the document with line numbers.
No. I think Harry may be asking for the spreadsheets that we provided.
Oh, sorry. So I misinterpreted the question. So Harry, you're asking for feedback on the Excel spreadsheets. Have we provided a timeline? I don't think we did we, in the email? So let's provide you a timeline right now. End of August?
Well, for end of July would be preferred,
Okay.
because there's going to be no work done on this on August.
So to answer that question, we're looking at feedback on the Excel files that were sent before the end of July, if that's possible.
Harry, you are unmuted if you have a response.
Oh, yes, that's what I was looking for, those timelines.
Okay, the next question is from Kevin Warren. Routine reporting projects should include airshed reports. What's listed is just what AEP is producing. Yeah, that's very, very correct.
But also the 5-year plan was intended to guide the work of EMS.
Yeah, so the implementation items within the 5-year plan is intended to guide the work that AEP is doing.
But we can recognize within the plan that there are other reports.
So yeah, I understand what you're saying, and maybe what we'll do is we will recognize that in the report, Kevin, to try to address your concern.
As we answer your question, I will unmute you.
I don't have anything further
You need to say,
to.
Kevin? No?
Yeah, I don't have anything further to add to that.
I probably talked too long and everyone left.
No, they're still there.
So the next question is from David Spink. How does this plan address our knowledge gaps related to understanding how atmospheric processes and/or meteorology are affecting PM 2.5 and ozone levels in hotspot areas?
So knowledge gaps would have been addressed as part of, well, you see, that's the problem with the emerging issues, the way it's defined. We have to think about that, David. I know what you mean. It could have technically been captured in that top part of the triangle, which we have labeled emerging issues, but the way you've, and I agree with what you're saying, the way the issues that, or the knowledge gaps that you identified may not fit nicely into that emerging issue class. But what we can promise to do is maybe we'll take what David has highlighted here and see how we can integrate it or integrate a knowledge gap component to the plan. What do you think, Kristen?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's,
Yeah, thank you, David. The next question is, what is the distributed monitoring? What is a distributed monitoring network? Okay. So when we say distributed, we mean that it is actually operated by a number of different parties. So each Airshed organization is, as you know, Kevin, is a autonomous organization, not-for-profit society. Reports up to a board of directors, does not report to Alberta Environment and Parks. These Airshed organizations basically do the monitoring for the majority of the province. And it's not, so the point really was it's not done by one single entity, such as an agency or a government, like many other jurisdictions. So the question is, when considering deposition effects, need to also consider eutrophication and possibility alkalization effects. How does the monitoring plan cover nitrogen deposition and nitrogen sensitive areas of the province, which may not be the same as acid deposition in sensitive areas? So that's a question that I was thinking about all during the presentation, but Yeni will respond.
And initially when the slides were being prepared, all the words deposition had acid in front of them, and I deleted that word, but Bob, during presenting, still said acid deposition.
Oh, okay, there we go.
So we are moving away, David, from just looking at just acidifying deposition, but also including eutrophication. That was not evident in this presentation, but is included as implementation items in the actual plan. And and I agree with you. So we are currently working on the critical loads for eutrophication, and so it's currently not captured in the implementation. But good point here. We will include it in the implementation that the sensitivity maps that are created for the next phase of the 5-year plan will include the eutrophication component of critical load, as well as just the acidification. But the sensitivity maps currently do include both sulfur and nitrogen. So from the deposition aspect, we're okay, but from the receptor sensitivity, I agree with you, and it will be included as an implementation item for the next phase of the sensitivity maps. I have written it down, David.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Yeni.
Thank you. Next question, looks like similar topic. Could you provide a little more detail on how dry deposition monitoring will be done, and in particular, how base cation deposition will be measured or determined?
Okay, so all we have at this point in the implementation is that the need to deploy dry deposition monitoring at least 2 sites. We're currently investigating methods that are currently used, keeping in mind that we previously did use the VAC system that has the denuder and filter train to collect samples, and then we infer from that. We haven't landed on a method yet, so if you know of a method that we should be including in our evaluation, we more than welcome that. But we're currently exploring possible methods.
Okay, I'll think about it, Yeni.
Thanks, Yeni. Next question is regarding portable air monitoring systems. Can also be used to stations instrumented the same as a permanent station, operated to the same standards, just on wheels or skids. So this is regarding the complementary air monitoring, which we didn't really talk about the traditional portable monitoring stations. So yeah, that's very much the case. And the cost is from $150 to $275K, depending on depending on what you have in that particular portable monitoring station. So that's a very good point, Kevin. And that is another primary method that is currently being used to address some of these gaps, and likely will still be used to address some of these gaps. Okay, the next question is, looking at all types of monitoring work not currently being done or being done to optimal degree and desirable in the future, what is AEP's proposed order or priorities to fill these gaps, and why that order of priority? So I think the answer to that question is we're going to, I think we still need to determine what our priority is for implementation. And I think we're using the analysis that we've done, and especially for community monitoring and for deposition monitoring, to actually determine what the priority is from AEP's perspective. I'm not sure if, I don't think I'm addressing your question very well, Bill.
Kind of try.
Well, I think there's a, thanks, Bob.
So if I'm understanding correctly, the question is around how did we prioritize the gaps and monitoring gaps, and why that priority? Maybe if you're unmuted, Bill, can you clarify your question?
Yeah, the question is at a slightly higher level than that.
Okay, so
not just the monitoring gaps.
I'll try and answer.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
So
looking at
the monitoring gaps that are highlighted are what we within the air science team consider to be priority, which is basically monitoring gaps within communities. And maybe it's not very clear in the presentation, but there were a number of criteria considered in ranking the gaps within the communities, and it will be clearer once you get a copy of the report. Okay.
Yeah, if I can.
There is. Go ahead, Bill.
If I can clarify, it was at a level 1 degree higher than that, and looking at all of the types of work. And I did send this question in before you noted that you'd be putting your implementation plan with priorities out as the next step, and I think that's going to be very important. But I'm thinking of such things as ensuring the adequacy of the NO2 monitoring, given the new CAKES, speeding up the CAKES assessments as two possibilities, and the public reporting, which, as you pointed out, Bob, has been kind of long promised, but very slow to come, are three possible priorities from my point of view. Then there's also within communities more specific monitoring priorities. But I think this next phase where you have that implementation plan with proposed priorities is going to be really key. And my suggestion is you have a shorter list of really key ones that are going to impact the really important elements of the system, get those done, rather than necessarily try to hit out in many directions at once, be riding many horses at once, because it seems important to get those really top priority things in place, done, underway before moving on to the next phase. But I hope there's a good chance for input and review on the implementation plan timing and priorities, which I think you've indicated there will be. So thanks.
Yeah, so no, that's the kind of input I think we need, Bill, is what you see kind of the priorities for implementation. So I think, yeah, definitely there's opportunity to influence those priorities, and we'll definitely take into account what you've said. So the next question is emerging issues, monitoring greenhouse gas levels, especially CO2. CO is done at urban sites.
Can I just ask a question? Was there a problem with the volume for the other ones? Because when we were addressing the other questions, we opened it up and nobody spoke. No, you don't know.
I'm not sure. It depends. It could be if they put their pin or not, but it seems to be fine.
Okay.
Okay. So this is a question regarding CO2 monitoring. So one thing we did say, and I maybe you could open it if Kevin is able to elaborate on this particular question. One thing we did say previously is we said ambient monitoring of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases is out of scope unless it's being done to understand air quality issues. So if we're monitoring, say, carbon dioxide in red deer, I'm not sure I see a real use of that particular data. We know what kind of carbon dioxide values we're going to get, and I'm not sure if monitoring that directly would help. Or were you looking more at monitoring global background carbon dioxide levels in Alberta, that kind of thing?
That's exactly what I'm thinking of. I mean, I don't, to my knowledge, know of any air quality monitoring stations in Alberta where carbon dioxide is being monitored, yet global warming is probably the biggest issue the planet is facing. And I'm wondering, is there a role for Alberta Environment, for Airsheds to be monitoring this concentrations? When you say what CO2 levels will be, I'm surprised by that. I think you think that you know what the range is, but actual levels, I don't think so. How are you going to know that?
Yeah. So I'm just thinking of how we would consider that.
I think it goes back to what Bill just said. It's not that it wasn't considered, but we identified other items that were of a more priority in terms of the emerging issues. But we have discussed previously about monitoring CO2 more at the regional level, not like within an urban center.
Right.
Sure.
So it has been brought up, Kevin Warren. There's a Warren too, but it's not you, Kevin.
Yeah.
But it was, we didn't go forward. And if you remember, Kevin, you've been at all of these webinars. If you remember the very first one, the monitoring of greenhouse gases was identified as out of scope. So that set the stage for the work that we did. But there's been so much shifting since the work started. So we would just, we'll table it now. But I don't think we have a response to Kevin's. Kevin's.
Yeah, I just think that in the eyes of the public, this is a huge issue, and it might be out of scope for this plan. But who's going to be monitoring this in Alberta, regionally, or background for global monitoring?
Mm-hmm.
It seems to be falling through the cracks.
And it definitely has been considered.
It was put on the table. Let's just put it at that. And then
I think
it was kind of considered out of scope, so we didn't focus on it. But I think you have a point there, Kevin.
Okay, so the next, maybe leave Kevin's line open. So Alberta data is also feeding into WAQI.info.
Yeah, he's just saying it's not only what we has there.
Oh, I see. Okay, so what's WAQI?
It's a really interesting website that, if you're not familiar with it, I provided the address. You should check out. I mean, all of Alberta's airshed stations and the provincial stations are feeding into it. They're getting their data somewhere. It's on a totally different scale than what we're using, but it's very informative because it puts everything in perspective. And there's something like 1,000 stations at least that are feeding into it, and it's all done graphically on a world map that you can zoom in and out of. It's just a really interesting site for putting what we're seeing here into a global perspective.
Right. Yeah, I do recall seeing this website when it first came out. So yeah, thanks for that, Kevin. Next one is CAKE's reporting process needs to be sped up. I think similar thing as Bill said, and releasing absolute data values, not just management classifications. Red, orange, we need to actual values to determine trends. So the speeding up and the actual values is almost inconsistent with each other. Where what we've done is we don't back out all the way down to the green anymore in terms of the anthropogenic influences, and that has helped cut a fair bit of time off the entire process. We actually do have the, what year is it? We have the 14 to 16 report done, and it's in the release process right now, which takes time. And then the 15 to 17 report is, the draft is pretty much done right now as well. So we will be catching up on this, so that we can catch up on this, but I'm not sure we're going to be able to report the values all the way down to the backed out green levels like was done in previously. It just takes too much time.
Can I also jump in? I think that it's pretty tough to calculate trends using the CAKES values because, well, for PM there's been changes in instrumentation. And then also with all of this backing out of the data, I think it's pretty hard to have a complete consistent time series for many, many years. I think we've been looking a little bit on how best to report on trends in ozone and, well, PM once we have consistent monitoring for enough years. So it's something that we're looking into for the state of environment reporting. So hopefully that will be helpful kind of information to support that.
Yeah, I would be interested in getting information about how you're planning on tracking trends then, because we and some of the jurisdictions such as the city of Red Deer within our Airshed have been looking at, how do we track trends, and given that CAKES are probably one of the reporting to CAKES, doing monitoring in support of CAKES is probably in the future one of the biggest directions that we're going to be going in. The ability to trend is quite important. And for example, the City of Red Deer's environmental plan, their indicators are based on, well, what we're based on Canada-wide standards, and they're looking at reviewing them. So yeah, I'd be interested to see what you guys are planning on. How are you going to trend? What are you going to be using for statistics?
Yeah. So yeah, and so I think that requires a further conversation, Kevin. And I think when we're doing the condition of the environment indicators, and I expect, I'm not sure, but I expect CAKES could be one of the indicators that we're going to be using. We're also planning to, from what I understand, we're planning to involve stakeholders as part of that process. So I think there's going to be more opportunity for you to provide input to that.
Okay.
Okay. So yes, that's a good non-answer to your question.
You're good at those, Bob.
Well, further conversation is required. That's what I'm saying. Next question is, don't see anything about implementation about assessing cost of implementation items and how the plan and implementation can be funded. Yeah, and that's.
Oh, Kevin, you were here at the first presentation when Bob said cost is out of scope.
Well, what we'll be doing is we're going to be looking at our what we're planning to do internally. We're going to be looking at our implementation items, assessing our priorities. Some things will not cost a lot, like some things we're doing right now, such as putting in the precipitation depth gauges. Like, they cost money for capital, so we're buying those over the years with the money that we have in our capital fund. But in terms of let's say saying we're going to spend $250,000 or $300,000 per community and put traditional monitors in each of the communities with large gaps. I guess we could say that, but there's not a very good likelihood that it's going to be funded. So,
but I think the actual plan, when we said it was out of scope, is that the plan will only look at the technical aspects to identify implementation items. Is that not correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, but also we always have costs in the back of our mind.
Yeah, so outside of the plan, after the implementation items have been identified, we've already got a recommendation to prioritize our implementation. So outside of that, and as part of the implementation process, and we said this towards the end of the slide where we said we kind of need to prioritize our items, and that is the time where we will start thinking like how easy are some items, how is it, and the cost associated with them should likely come in at that point, I think, but not part of the actual planned work. We were told to be blind to cost while we are doing that.
But having said that, within EMSD, we're going to be, based on our priorities, where we are going to be determining the cost, and we're going to be providing that up to our
items
to our
that
executive.
We will be funding.
That's
there
right.
are some implementation items that are more complex than others.
Right. Yeah. So, but that's part of our direction, and that's one of the reasons we were asked to actually have our plan done by the end of August or by September of 2018, is that there was potential to put in and ask for resources for the upcoming fiscal year.
Yeah. But we should also say that we weren't pie in the sky when doing this. I mean, we were told to be blind to cost, but we were trying to be as pragmatic as we can.
And realistic.
Yeah, and realistic.
Yeah. So, but the costs are not. You're right, Kevin. The costs are not included in the 5-year plan.
Okay. Well, any implementation plan, it might not spell out the costs, but it certainly has to be cognizant of them. And you've indicated that you are going to be taking them into consideration when you're prioritizing, what's going to be done. So I think that should that should be acknowledged.
Right. Thanks for that comment, Kevin. The next one is in the 5-year plan. In the 5-year plan, focuses on the provincial scale monitoring and evaluation. Why is region-specific, i.e. oil sands condition of environment reporting, a task included in implementation? Should focus not be on provincial? Yeah, how come you picked that one out, Ken? Because I had to say, I know he's right. You're right, Ken, as part of that. And we are doing kind of a condition of the environment reporting for oil sands region, and probably it should not be included as part of this 5-year plan. But it's something we are working on.
Can you give that as an example?
Well, we put it as an implementation item.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, so I think that's an implementation item that needs to be rewritten, and I didn't notice it when I was going through the presentation. So I think you're right.
Thanks, Bob. Good presentation. Appreciate it.
Okay, then next one is from yourself as well. I missed the location of the new Catmon station. So that is near Joussard, Alberta, which I think is near Lesser Slave Lake.
Yeah.
So you.
Yeah. And the actual location of that site will be included in a map that's in the plan.
Oh, okay, so we will have the location of the site in the plan.
Thanks. I know there's been off and on discussion of a Catmon station up in the oil sands region. Has there been any discussion of that?
Well, the Joussard station is actually being implemented as part of the oil sands monitoring plan. So the discussion for the Catmon stations as part of oil sands was to monitor far downwind and far upwind of oil sands region, but not to monitor right in the oil sands region. So there has been, I think, 3 stations established, 2 in Saskatchewan, and 1 just north of Wood Buffalo National Park, and it's actually in the Northwest Territories. And then the one that's far to the west of the oil sands region, kind of surrounding the oil sands region as part of the oil sands monitoring plan. So those are the Catmon sites that have been established in Western Canada. So I can't quite remember the names of the Saskatchewan sites right now, but they're probably on Catmon's website. But no, there was not an intent to put a Catmon station right in the Athabasca oil sands region.
But there were the enhanced deposition monitoring.
Right. So the enhanced deposition, do they monitor?
They monitor precipitation, but they don't look at ions.
Right.
So not equivalent.
That's the thing.
Yeah, I think the discussion was more internal to the oil sands region, where we were wondering if there was a way of cross-calibrating between the methods. But I don't know enough about that to extend the discussion any further, so thanks for the
Okay. Yeah, we'll keep that. We'll flag that, Ken.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Next question from Bob. Is PASA not in the list of passives because we've implemented Sonoma Technologies recommendations, rationalizing the passive network? So we could include PASA as part of the optimization as well. But yeah, the answer to your question is yes, that's the reason I didn't include it in the list, just because there was an evaluation that was done a while ago, and PASA has implemented those recommendations. But if PASA does want us to do a further evaluation of their network, we'd be happy to do that.
I think you're just listing the ones that we actually did the work.
Right, yeah. Okay, so the next question is, again, on the Excel spreadsheet, can a station have more than one classification? No, it can't.
No, and I can phone you, Harry, after this afternoon if you're in, or we can maybe take this offline. Because I understand what's happening.
Right.
He doesn't have the full chart, so he has no idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
Next question from Wayne. With the Airshed focus on transportation, how will stakeholder engagement be implemented under data evaluation and reporting? So I'm wondering, Wayne, would you mind providing more context to that question? I'm not sure. I don't want to guess about it. If you're still on the phone, maybe provide more context. But he has to enter his ID, right?
He's unmuted. We can hear him. We can hear you, Wayne.
I got no mic. Sorry.
So Wayne, do you mind explaining the question a little bit more? I don't want to kind of guess at what you mean. Oh, Wayne, are you there?
Wayne?
Oh, we can't hear you if you're talking.
When you see the little speaker thing, that means that
I think he's clicking.
Yeah.
We just can't hear.
We'll just tell him to fill out.
Yes, but can't speak.
Oh. Okay, so I'm not sure how to answer the question.
Well, can he touch base with you?
Yeah, maybe touch base with us afterwards, Wayne. It sounds like you're trying to talk, but we can't hear you.
I don't think he can talk, and he's maybe somewhere public where he can't talk.
Oh. Okay. So I don't want to try to answer it because I'm not sure the context. So we can follow up with you on that, Wayne. So next one's from Bob. Catmon Station at Canuso, not Jussard, as mentioned. Oh, really? No, I don't think so.
No, it's Jussard.
You sure?
Yeah. Where's
Canuso
Canuso?
is, well, it's on the way, in the same area of the province. I'm pretty sure it's.
Well, the station is called Jussard, so you may be right. We don't know.
Yeah. I get. How far is Jussard from Canuso?
About 35 kilometers.
Okay, so
it might be correct. You might be right.
You might be right. You might. Okay. So next question from Eric, all the way from the U.S. In your review of the passive sampling, are you working to harmonize detection limits and data reporting, or are you focused mainly on the numbers and locations of sites? So I think it's the second. We're focused on the mainly on the numbers and the locations of sites, and I don't think we have been, to be completely honest, I don't think we focused on the detection limits at all.
Yeah, so I think that is what Kristen's doing, but there's two sides to the work. There's one side that assumes that the data collected meets the objective and the data quality is good, and then you just try to resolve for any redundancies. That's the one aspect of it. The other aspect, I'll just let Kristen talk.
Yeah, I guess the other aspect is trying to understand how the data from the passives can be used and kind of taking a look at possible biases between passives and continuous stations. So I've run some comparisons looking at how consistent the time series are for passives versus continuous. There are some flags in the data, some drifts between data sets, biases, some of these are known. So we kind of, I guess, left it at that in the plan at this point anyways, that if we're to use the data for our reporting, we should, I guess, be careful and make sure that it is meeting the intent of the type of reporting that we're doing. And then I guess there's also some work by Long Fu's group on deploying co-located passive samplers and trying to understand biases between them. Is there anything you wanted to add?
I was just going to say that with respect to the detection limit, we've actually only have considered the H2S passives for, is that FLAP? Or Cold Lake, right? For
Leica, yeah.
Yeah, and Leica area. So the only mention about issues with detection limit has been associated with just that parameter.
So I think, Eric, you're unmuted if you wanted to respond. Okay, I don't think we can hear you.
He's not talking.
Oh, okay. Okay, so the next question was for the bulk deposition monitoring. How many sites are you considering and what approach? For example, have you considered ion exchange resins?
Everything is on the table right now, Eric. It's just the same thing as the dry deposition issue that David Spink raised. We've only, just a little bit of context for that one. We considered the bulk deposition monitoring to be a component, potentially a component of the long-term monitoring, because when we talked with our ecosystem and water scientists, the kind of information need they had, we could not provide with the current monitoring platform we have, which is basically a site that needs to be visited every week and needed power. So in order to meet that knowledge gap or monitoring need, we thought bulk deposition would be more appropriate. So right now we're evaluating what's out there to see what would be the best platform. And yes, ion exchange resins are also included there. I know that there's some work being done for the oil sands area to kind of examine the, I don't want to say viability, but the use of the data collected using the ion exchange resins.
Okay. So Eric, if you have a response, and if you're still on the line, you can speak. You're unmuted. Okay.
Oh.
We hear rustling.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, I'm sorry. I had to step away from my desk a minute. I had a delivery that I had to go downstairs to receive.
Okay.
So yes, I did hear the tail end of the discussion on the bulk deposition, and I'm glad to hear that you're looking at the different approaches. The IERs, of course, are low tech, if you will, but they, if they also give you nice opportunities to sample at longer intervals at maybe more sites. So I would strongly consider suggest that you consider both the anion and the cation resins for the bulk deposition work.
Okay, I think we agree with you. Thanks, Eric. The next question you had is, as a focus study, would you consider adding precip depth gauges to urban sites before relocating to high priority sites? So I'm not sure why we would do that.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking about the long history of data that has been generated for several urban sites across Alberta. The data themselves seem to be of high quality, but as you've already noted, there is an issue with the absence of precipitation depth information. So the interpretation of those historical data sets is a little bit murky, I would say. And I'm just wondering if maybe for a year or two before moving on, you could sort of install the precipitation depth gauge, collect the precipitation chemistry exactly the way you have, and then see how big a difference it makes. And that way you might be able to at least put some constraints on the interpretability of the historical data.
Right. So we did kind of a cursory evaluation of the collection efficiency of the precip samplers, as well as how good our estimation of precipitation depth is using the current method. There are a handful of sites that have nearby precip depth monitors. So we have information for those sites. The thing about the urban sites, Eric, is that one of the sites is already, the station is already closed. So after we started this evaluation, the station is kind of already closed. So then maybe, yeah, and the Edmonton site doesn't have the history, so maybe the only one that's remaining is really the Fort McMurray site. So we'll definitely consider your suggestion for that specific site.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay. The next question we have here will go down to Bob's question. An emerging issue is proposed for Saskatchewan Northwest, south of the Wapiti River, along Highway Pipeline Nexus, Monty Shale boom currently going. Okay. So basically, Bob, you're talking about the activity going on with the Montney Shale. Yeah.
So MDU Greenview is proposing to have an industrial area within the green zone to process and provide backup for all the oil and gas activities south of the Wapiti, to draw it out of the city of Grand Prairie.
Right. Okay. So I think that's a good suggestion, and that's definitely an emerging area, or an area that's booming. So
there's no existing monitoring data in the area.
No.
For background to assess trend, and the MDU Greenview touts as an environmentally responsible development. So with no background, it's pretty hard to assess whether it meets that criteria or not.
Right. So you need some evidence. Okay. No, thank you. That's a good suggestion, Bob. Are there more questions?
Yes. There's a few hands raised. It's got to go.
Oh, okay. We're going to the hands that are raised.
Okay, so first one is. Yes, first one's Atta. Okay.
Okay, Atta, we have you raised your hand. Did you want to ask a question? You've had your hand raised for 54 minutes. So I think, Atta, you're unmuted right now, and in order to ask the question, he has to enter a code. No, you didn't, right?
You should be able to ask the question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Atta, are you still there?
Okay.
Okay, so we can't hear you.
He's not speaking.
He's not speaking, so he's not.
He must be somewhere else.
Okay, so we'll try next one.
Okay. Gordon.
Next one's from Gordon. Make sure it's a tough question, Gordon.
Actually, I took my hand down. Now it's popped up again on its own. So sorry, I don't actually have a question.
Oh, too bad. I was hoping you'd have
I was playing with the buttons, so.
Okay. Next one. Yeah.
No, Pablo cannot ask a question.
He can, so. Hey, Pablo, we have your hands up now.
And he too was playing with the button, I think.
Omri's going to say something about CO2 monitoring, right? Go ahead and speak, Kwamru. We can't quite hear you.
Yeah, I'm not online.
Oh, we can hear you though.
Oh, can you? Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, again, I was playing with it and it just clicked. I have no. Well, I do have something in our team meetings and so and stuff as a follow-up, but I don't have anything yet. Sorry about that.
Thanks, Kwamru.
And there was no question from Ada either, so I guess that's it.
Okay, are there any more questions from anybody?
Raise his hand again.
Really? I think he's doing a mistake.
Just play.
Let's just check one last time for hands.
I don't see anything.
Okay.
No, I think David Spink tried to speak earlier, but we couldn't hear him.
Okay, let's try.
See if you have anything else. Okay.
David, we unmuted you. It sounded like you were trying to say something, but you couldn't. So you're unmuted.
No. It was a tail end. But Bob, I want to thank you for this webinar. And I missed the middle one, but the first one. But Bob, I would like to make the comment that, well, these are informative and a good opportunity to get a sense of what you folks are doing, and you're obviously working hard. But it really is not a substitute for inviting people into a room and spending a half a day or a day talking about some of these issues. And, I could ask lots of questions. I was interested in your response to Eric's question about ion exchange resins and so on. And I think at some point in time, or at appropriate points in time, you need to organize, I don't know what we call it, an information workshop or something, and give people the opportunity to come and pursue some of these topics in more detail, exchange ideas, and so on. So, well, this is very good, and I thank you for it. As you know, Bob, I do not think it's a substitute for appropriate face-to-face type discussions when appropriate.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much, David, and I completely understand. And I think, as I've mentioned to you before, we are open to having further meetings or possibly workshop, more face-to-face. Again, we haven't done this through a multi-stakeholder process, and I completely recognize that. But having a workshop where we can have more fulsome discussion might be a good next step.
Thanks, Bob.
Okay, is there more?
Don't think so. Nope. That's it.
Okay, well, I wanted to thank everyone for attending, especially in the middle of July, when you probably would rather be doing something else. Surprised we were able to get as many attendees as we did, so that's great to see. As a follow-up, we are planning to share the document. I think we said by the end of August with stakeholders. So we'll follow up with that, and then after that, we'll see what kind of stakeholder engagement we can do in terms of workshops or additional meetings. So thanks very much, everybody, and have a good rest of your day.